Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce you all to Killian, a YouTuber who is most well known for his commentary series where he plays a skeleton character named Lord Killian. He primarily covers topics like science and religion, and when he does, I believe he does so incredibly well. In fact, those of you who read the SCC Wiki probably know him as the person who inspired my New Earth commentary. And by the way, if you aren't reading the SCC Wiki, you should. It has a lot of potential and I really like where it's going. However, then politics comes up and he and I don't always see eye to eye. Hence this commentary on his video on Mr. Beat. Let's get started.
I'm Mr. Beat and I'm in love. In love with the US Constitution.
I don't even.
So you don't give us any introduction to who it is you're covering, and your first interjection is you being confused. Not actually making a point or criticism, just sounding confused for a couple of seconds. This is not going to end well, is it? Also, I don't want to spend too long nitpicking his background, but why is a cartoon skeleton drinking a realistic martini? At least I think that's a martini. Even ignoring the fact that I don't think skeletons can drink things, I know for a fact that pictures can't. Or is this like in Roger Rabbit, where he can drink it, but instead of getting drunk, he just rapidly ascends into the air like he's a goddamn rocket ship?
It's like my favorite Constitution ever, seriously.
I mean, relatively speaking, I guess?
Well, yeah, all favorites are relative to the things in that category. That's just how favorites work. Oh, I'm also going to be doing quite a bit of skipping around until we actually get to Beat's list, just so you all know.
However, it's not perfect, because things change, man.
The Constitution is a document of universal principles.
No, it's a document that sets up a government.
Sometimes, like in the case of slavery in the past and income tax today,
yes, the two genders.
They get the principles wrong. Other times, like freedom of speech and the right to keep and bear arms, they get it right. But principles are either always right or always wrong. They don't change with the times. So if you're basing it on how things are at the time or how things change, you're doing it wrong.
Really? So there's no difference between advocating for, just to use one of your examples, the right to bear arms in the 1780s versus today? Because to give everyone an idea on just how much our technology regarding firearms has progressed in that just under quarter of a millennia, the first ever gun that could hold more than one bullet was the Colt revolver invented in 1835. I'm not even in favor of most forms of gun control. However, I do have to acknowledge that, yeah, advocating for something way back then is different than advocating for it now because we have so radically changed in that time. Obviously, this doesn't mean that we set an expiration date on all our principles and then throw them out. But an honest person should be able to admit that their beliefs will change as time moves forward. That's just the basics of being slightly open-minded. This is also ignoring the fact that the Bill of Rights does contain relativistic language. For example, the Third Amendment reads, "No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law." So, quartering a soldier into somebody's house without their consent is not inherently wrong. It's only wrong if it's not done during a time of war, and not done via a manner prescribed by law. The Fifth Amendment reads, "No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on the presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces, or in the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger." Again, am I the only one who thinks that these universal principles are a tad more situation-based than Shane makes them out to be? Or how about the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment? Well, wait a minute, What makes a punishment unusual? That in of itself is entirely relative. Capital punishment, for example, was once incredibly usual. Today, it is much less so. I could go on, but I think you guys get my point. Our founding fathers were never totally dogmatic about what they wrote down. They acknowledged that circumstances change and there could be examples where something that is perfectly okay in one situation is not okay in another.
But there have been some unintended consequences to making the Constitution difficult to change.
Let me guess. It doesn't let government do things that you like, right?
I don't know, Shane. Why don't we let Beat's video play out a little more and see if that is what he says?
You see, now we often rely a lot on the Supreme Court to just interpret the Constitution differently to push reform forward. I don't think most of the founders saw that one coming.
Now, Shane does go on to argue against this notion. However, that one small quip, I think, demonstrates probably the biggest issue with this commentary. You see, Shane is very jumpy in this video. He immediately attempts to, as quick as possible, find some way to discredit Beat, regardless of if it's even relevant sometimes. When we get into the list, there will be quite a few entries where Shane just stops to essentially roll his eyes and go, "Oh man, that's so stupid," before Beat even gets a chance to explain his reasoning. There are also quite a few points where he takes Beat out of context, but we'll get to those in a bit.
Here are my top 10 proposed constitutional amendments.
All right, let's take this on.
I want to lower the voting age to 16.
Yep, called it.
16 and 17-year-olds often work and pay federal income taxes, and they're also legally allowed to drive and can be tried as adults if they commit crimes.
And they can also be easily coerced and manipulated.
So can every human being in all of existence. And Shane, if this really is your main opposition to allowing 16-year-olds to vote, I have to wonder, do you think we should limit voting to those not deemed easily manipulated? And if so, how would you determine such a thing?
Just look around at the people who want this age lowered and you'll see. There are always people who want government to be much bigger than it is.
Really? Because I spent a couple of minutes in your comment section and I saw two people, both of whom seem to be on your side politically, who agreed with lowering the voting age to 16. Oh, also, this is a total ad hominem on Shane's part. The value of ideas are not judged by the other ideas people who have those ideas hold. That was a bit of a mouthful. Instead, they're determined on their own merits. Saying this idea is bad because this person who holds this idea also holds all these other bad ideas isn't actually an argument.
The next one is an actual proposed amendment almost ratified in the 1970s, known as the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA.
Oh, for the love of Mike, all of the functional parts of the ERA were passed over the course of about 150 years. That part from the 1970s is just the leftover part, which is really pretty meaningless.
Funny you mention this because Beat actually addresses this criticism slightly later in this entry in a part that, by the way, Shane completely cut out.
Is the ERA really needed when laws and the courts have mostly done a good job fighting for women's rights? I say yes, because just because you don't see discrimination against women now doesn't mean you won't see it in the future. Oh, and one more thing. You do see discrimination against women now. A lot of times, it's just more under the radar. And here's another actual proposed amendment, nicknamed the Saving Democracy Amendment.
You are aware that America is not supposed to be a democracy, right? Maybe in your meticulous perusal of the Constitution, you missed Article 4, Section 4.
I have that exact section of the Constitution on screen right now, but to make it quick, this is incredibly misleading. Whenever the Founding Fathers talked about democracy, they were strictly referring to direct democracy, with their definition of a republic being much closer to what we would currently call a representative democracy. With that said, even if Beat wanted to turn the US into a direct democracy, and side note, I should also point out that if you amend the Constitution, you can't cite another part of the Constitution as to why that amendment would be invalid. That's not how amendments work. We're amending it to change it. But even if Mr. Beat did want the US to be more directly democratic, that doesn't even necessarily go against Article 4, Section 4, as the Supreme Court ruled in the 1912 case Pacific State Telephone and Telegraph Corporation v. Oregon.
Section 1. The rights protected by the Constitution of the United States are the rights of natural persons and do not extend to for-profit corporations, limited liability companies, or other private entities established for business purposes or to promote business interests under the laws of any state, the United States, or any foreign state.
Yeah, this guy doesn't like the Citizens United case. See all my previous videos on that. Let me ask you this. What part of a business or corporation isn't people?
The building they meet in, the machines they use, the floors that they walk on, just off the top of my head.
Answer, none!
Oh, well, never mind then.
That's what they are! People who have gotten together for a specific purpose.
No, they're legal entities separate from their distinct owner. I also want to point out just how vague his definition of corporations are. A film set is also a group of people meeting together for a specific purpose. Does that mean that the set of Lady and the Water was in of itself a person? In high school, I did things like speech and debate and drama, and in those clubs, we all met together for a specific purpose. Does that mean that the high school drama club was itself a human being? Hell, I'm in multiple Discord servers where we all meet together for a specific purpose, that being to talk to each other. Can we legally get our Discord server recognized as a corporation and therefore turn it into a human?
And you want them to lose rights when they do! So as soon as you get together with your buddies to pool your resources in order to be able to amplify your voice, which you'd need to do if you're not already rich, Mr. Beat would immediately step in and take it away from you, basically guaranteeing the right to the means of speech, which costs money, to the rich.
The issue at hand has never been common people pulling their resources together. The issue has always been a group of people with more resources than anyone else then pulling their resources together and using that as a means to drown out the voice of the average person. The fact is, the means of speech which cost money are always going to be used more by the wealthy than by the poor, because it's the wealthy who have more money to spend on communication in the first place. Hence why we didn't see this utopia of small political corporations popping up out of nowhere with grassroots money in the wake of the Citizens United case. Mind you, this isn't something that I like, but this is the undeniable truth about the world we live in with our current system. The only way to change it would be to fundamentally reform the entire system from the ground up, which I'm not even necessarily opposed to, by the way.
That's exactly what Citizens United was about. A group of people got together to form a nonprofit organization and produced a documentary critical of Hillary Clinton. The Federal Election Commission shut them down.
No, they didn't. Citizens United preemptively sued the FEC over a month before Hillary the movie was released.
Well, as one of my YouTube viewers wrote, quote, "If corporations are people, then they should be able to receive the death penalty. Oh, snap. I agree."
Really? The death penalty for speech? The death penalty is evil enough as it is, but you want to use it for speech?
First off, being eligible does not mean using it in every and all circumstances. That's just simply not what the word eligible means. And second off, that was a joke meant to make fun of the idea of corporations being people, because the idea of giving a corporation the death penalty is inherently absurd, especially considering corporations are not even physical entities, so what exactly would you be putting to death?
The Electoral College will no longer pick the president.
Of course. Could have made money betting on that one.
Couldn't you make money betting on anything? Okay, I get the point is supposed to be that this entry was predictable. However, I should also note that if it really is so predictable, that would actually make it harder for you to win money betting on it, because that means less people would be willing to bet against it.
American citizens will directly elect the president.
Because you want rich cities to choose the president, with poor and rural areas basically having no say.
You do know there are more poor people than rich people, right? Just mathematically. Also, rural areas would still get their say. Their say would just be proportional to what percent of the population they are. For that matter, let's say a nightmare scenario does happen where all the rich urban people vote for one candidate for president, while all the poor rural people vote for the other, and also, I guess, suburban people just don't exist in this equation. And the candidate of the rich urban people wins in a landslide. Well, any agenda that new president would want to enact would still have to go through Congress, including the Senate, where poor rural states have disproportionate representation, because every state has equal representation, and poor rural states have the least people.
Because they pick the Democratic politicians you like!
Well, whose fault is that? Him for wanting actual representation in government, or conservatives for being so unable to appeal to large swaths of the population they have to artificially rig the game in their favor?
I'm still for federalism here.
No, you aren't!
Well, you just took that clip out of context. Here it is in Beat's original video.
Now, at the state level, there could be additional reforms, like implementing ranked choice voting, approval voting, or score voting. I'm still for federalism here. Let the states still run their own elections. However, count every vote. One person, one vote. And if you think I'm naive about the importance of the Electoral College, you are sadly mistaken.
Yeah, except I'm not. Your video on it is just full of straw man arguments and ridicule, and doesn't even acknowledge the real reason it exists, which I just explained. And I kid you not, folks, one time he even says right out that he doesn't want people in rural areas to have their say. Direct quote. But today, less than 15% Americans live in rural areas. No offense to those living in rural areas, but why should you have that much leverage over everyone else? That urban elitism is exactly what he wants. He wants his rich, powerful elite to run roughshod over people in rural states.
So, one person, one vote, everyone's vote is counted equally, regardless of what geographical area they're from, is elitism to you. Personally, I would call artificially extending representation to people disproportionately far more elitist than giving everyone an equal playing field, but I guess I'm just crazy like that.
But our rights do not cease to exist just because we're outnumbered.
Especially our right to disproportionate say in who is president, the most sacred of all of them.
Our founders understood that. Mr. Beat doesn't care. By way of analogy, blacks are also roughly 15% of the population. What if he'd said, "No offense to black people, but why should you have that much leverage over everyone else?" He'd be condemned as a hideous racist.
You know, it's funny that's your example, considering the Electoral College actually does disproportionately give power to white voters. Yeah, you know those urban areas you're worried would pick the president without the Electoral College? That's where minorities tend to live. That, put together with the fact that, as you did correctly point out, most of those areas are very safely Democratic, leads to minority voters actually having very little power when it comes to picking the president.
The whole point is that you amplify minority voices. That's one big difference between a democracy and a republic. In a democracy, minority voices get shouted down. In a republic, you amplify their voices so that their rights are protected. He doesn't want that because his team is in the majority.
A republic is just a government without a monarchy, and by the way, republics do not necessarily amplify minority voices. There's no congressional district for the Flat Earth Society, despite the fact they are a very fringe minority. And Scientologists don't have 2 seats in the Senate. Minority voices do get a say on the condition that they can compete in elections in communities. What you're referring to when you're talking about not infringing upon their rights is just the concept of inalienable rights. It has nothing to do with the fundamentals of a republic in general.
The 17th article of amendment to the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed.
So, yeah, I agree with this, but haven't you just spent this whole video whining about how we're not enough of a direct democracy? Why do I have a feeling there's a catch?
Probably because he opened the entry by saying this.
My top 3 proposed amendments, collectively think of them as a compromise because they do go together quite well, if I don't mind saying so myself, which I just did.
Also, the last entry involved you complaining about how Beat wants well-connected political elites to control everything, and now you're saying that you believe the Senate should be picked by state legislators, essentially making it so all senators are going to be political insiders.
Because guess what comes next?
Here we go.
The U.S. House of Representatives will have 930 members.
Just wow. And he even admits...
And of course would also make it so that there would be 1,033 electoral votes, assuming the Electoral College still existed.
To throw things even further towards his beloved elites.
How would more electoral votes, including in rural conservative areas, lead to more power being thrown to big cities?
Oh, and you might be wondering where I'm getting that 930 number? I just pulled it out of thin air. Just kidding, I got it from an article, this article here by Chris Wilson.
Who just pulled it out of thin air.
Wilson uses math to limit disparity in representation.
By which he means give more power to Democrats.
So, wait a minute, did he pull the number out of thin air, or was it specifically designed to give more power to Democrats? I don't care which one you think it is, I just want consistency here. Oh, also, are you going to, actually explain how Wilson's model would give more power to Democrats? Of course you're not, we're just skipping over that part. Anyway, that's all I want to cover, so final thoughts? It's a skeleton screaming no for 20 minutes. What else is there to say? Good night and good luck.